This door. Hold on, I see.
Okay, well, hello everybody, and welcome to another exciting week of the joint CCIS and CSIM book series between UCSD and UCLA co-organized. My name is Claire Edita. I am co-director of CCIS, the Center for Comparative Immigration Studies at UC San Diego. And today we have the pleasure of hosting Dr. James McCann, Professor of Political Science at Purdue University, and Professor Michael Jones-Correa, President's Distinguished Professor of Political Science and Director of the Center for the Study of Race, Ethnicity, and Immigration at the University of Pennsylvania. They will provide us a presentation of their book, Holding Fast, Resilience and Civic Engagement Among Latino Immigrants. That presentation will last about 25 minutes. We'll then have the pleasure of hearing comments from today's discussant, Professor Zoli Hajnal, Professor of Political Science at UC San Diego and Director of the Yankelovich Center for Social Science Research. Dr. Hajnal will speak for about 10 minutes. We'll then give the authors about 5 minutes to respond, and we'll open it up to your questions and comments here in the audience for the remaining about 20 to 40 minutes. If you would like to ask a question, we ask that you do so via the Q&A function on your Zoom window. You can also just raise your hand if you'd prefer to be called out and just ask your answer in person live. We can do that as well. So either use the Q&A function or just use the raise hand function. Okay, well, with no further ado, let's turn it over to Drs. McCann and Jones-Correa.
All righty. Well, thanks so much, Claire. Can you hear me okay? All right, good. I'm going to go ahead and screen share, and let's make sure that this comes across. Okay. Oops. Okay. So thanks to the organizers of this. We've been looking forward to making this presentation. Since time is short, Michael and I are just going to go for a sort of broad overview of our book project and related work. We'll also talk a little bit, I'm sure, about our data set that we collected that is going to go live very soon. Why don't I start by sort of casting a broad net, talking a little bit about the importance of resilience in democracies overall. Okay, so let's note that in all democracies around the world, there's always going to be a greater number of high office seekers rather than actual high offices for those office seekers to fill. This is called the problem of ambition in political science, and it's really incumbent on democracies to figure out what are the reasonable institutions and rules that are going to be, perceived as fair for winnowing down that set of ambitious office seekers into a reasonable set of actual office holders. This whole system hangs on the premise that unsuccessful candidates actually conceding defeat, if not gracefully, at least definitively. And in the US context, in the presidential elections of 1960, 2000, 2016, those were very bruising, very polarizing electoral contests, and yet the losers readily conceded defeat. Of course, having lived most recently through the 2020 presidential campaign, Donald Trump, really did a 180-degree turnaround on that norm, and it remains to be seen what the impact of that will be on sort of democratic practice. But at the mass level, for what it's worth, much research suggests that in the United States and in other democracies, thwarted voters tend to get over their losses with not very many long-lasting grudges. Some research even suggests that in the aftermath of a loss, unsuccessful voters might even hold democracy in higher esteem or have greater faith in democratic institutions. So to put it in Albert Hirschman's very well-known terms, following a bruising electoral defeat, we would hope and expect to find voters expressing their loyalty to the political regime and being willing to express their voice in future election contests, and very little exiting. The line that we hear all the time during elections, that if candidate X wins, I'm going to be moving to Canada. Well, that seems to be a rather rare event, which is generally good news for democracy. Okay, so now turning to the subject at hand, immigrants. For Michael and me, we treat immigrants following the 2016 elections as a hard case for political resilience. Let's note that in the US, nearly 1 out of 5 residents, adult residents, is foreign born. So we're talking about a minority, but a fairly substantial minority. And in the 2016 campaigns, let's recall as well that Trump was unequivocally hostile to the core identities and interests of much of the foreign-born population. At the same time, the norms of resilience after disappointment, this sort of loser's consent idea, might be less familiar and established for immigrants who are newer to the United States. If any reminding is needed of the context there in the 2016 campaign, let's recall that during this campaign, Trump was consistently and really vociferously voicing this very strident anti-immigrant agenda. Content analysis of Trump's rhetoric during the 2016 campaign found that no subject came out as frequently as immigrants and refugees during that campaign. And for every one thing positive that was said about immigrants or refugees, Trump said 5 negative things. So we're talking about, a real divisive, negative attack on immigrants and their supporters. In terms of policies, Trump as well consistently advocated anti-immigrant policies that were at odds with previous Republican nominees and certainly Democratic Party nominees as well. Among the major policies that he put forward were things like, building a wall between the US and Mexico and having Mexico pay for that wall, dramatically increasing the number of deportation agents and increasing the number of deportations. He attacked sanctuary cities and threatened to block funding for those cities. He said he wanted to terminate the Obama-era DACA executive order, and then he wanted to place significant limits on refugees, especially refugees from majority Muslim countries. Okay, so a very, very robust attack on immigrants and refugees came out during the campaign. Immigrants were not deaf to this. They they definitely received those anti-immigrant messages and reacted during the campaign by expressing fairly negative views of Trump himself. Okay, so this graph shows the results on feeling thermometer, 0 to 100 point affective scales, going from very cold to very warm among Latino immigrants. That's from our survey, which we'll detail in a few minutes. We put the mean and the median scores on feeling thermometers towards Trump alongside, for Latino immigrants, alongside US-born Latinos, African Americans, and whites. And as you can see, it just really jumps out in this graph that Latino immigrants, even in comparison to US-born Latinos, yeah, they were they felt very cold towards Trump. The median itself clocks in at below 2 points on this 100-point scale. So we are talking about a very frigid reaction to the candidate, which is completely understandable. So naturally, you would think in the aftermath of the election, there would be, a fair amount of negative feelings. We'll unpack that in a second. So the key questions for our book and in our research, okay, are presented on this slide here. To what extent did the Trump election lead to political disappointment among immigrants? Okay, did it derail the trajectory of incorporation into U.S. democracy? More specifically, do we see any signs of exiting? And we think of exiting as kind of a soft and a hard exit. A soft exit would be indicated by apathy, withdrawal, disengagement, demoralization, cynicism about Americans or American governing institutions, and so on. A harder exit, more in line with what Hirschman would suggest, would be a literal kind of remove yourself from the country. And many immigrants do have an exit option. Okay, so we were, interested in tracking both kinds of exiting, and putting the two forms of exiting together leads to a civic erosion hypothesis. The question being, did the election of an anti-immigrant administration lead to the erosion of immigrants' political trust, efficacy, and civic engagement? By way of background, the dominant media narrative, if you think back to the time after the 2016 election, reports on NPR and the major news outlets and so on, really emphasized there was a lot of fear and dismay among immigrants. These images here that we took from the internet really showcase that. So interviews with immigrant activists or immigrants running businesses and so on, they all said things like, they're reconsidering whether to remain in the country, or they're very apprehensive about what's coming. There's this looming storm and so on. Okay, so that was the kind of dominant narrative. And we know in political science some implications of fear and anxiety. These kinds of disquieting emotions might undercut civic engagement and be corrosive in all kinds of ways for democratic practice. So hence, we wanted to investigate this more fully. And we did so through analysis, largely from these surveys that we ourselves fielded. They go by the name of the Latino Immigrant National Election Studies. In 2012, Michael and I did our first line study. That was more or less fielded in parallel with the American National Election Study. So for those of you who are familiar with that design, it's a sort of pre-election, post-election survey that covers, a wide array of survey indicators. In our case, we ran this with sampling not conditioned on civic status or anything. So we have lots of non-citizens as well as citizens. In total, just over 1,300 survey respondents took part in that survey. Then in 2016, we wanted to change the design a bit, and we were mindful of more longer term dynamics. And so we fielded a 3-wave panel survey. The first wave started a little earlier in the election cycle, August and September of 2016, when 1,800 Latino immigrants were randomly selected and interviewed by telephone. Then following the election, we recontacted as many as possible. The recontact rate, as we report here, is 32%, which is a bit lower than what you would expect for a more conventional panel survey, but it's about in keeping with immigrant surveys. This is a harder survey population in many ways. Anticipating the attrition that we found, we also enriched the sample with 260 fresh respondents at that time. Then in the summer of 2017, we went back to the same pool of respondents and supplemented as well with some fresh folks. And so that's the line survey in a nutshell. Let me just say, I'm not going to go into many methodological details, but we'd be happy during the Q&A to talk about sampling strategies, survey design, strategies for assessing attrition biases and things like that. Okay, so on to the findings. Was there indeed a lot of immigrant anxiety, and what else was going on in terms of reactions within this population? Okay, and the first thing to note here is that, yes, there was indeed a fair amount of immigrant anxiety, but that wasn't the whole story. There was also a fair amount of anger, okay? And this slide shows results on responses to the question, has Trump made you feel angry? Has he made you feel afraid? And so putting the two together, what we find is it's a rather rare immigrant who did not have any such negative reactions. More than 80% in each survey wave before the election and in the summer of 2017 voiced at least some negative emotion, with the principal disposition being both anger and fear. And much of our book is dedicated to kind of parsing out the implications of these emotions for democratic incorporation. In terms of general views of where the country is going, a huge uptick in disappointment with the direction of the country. So by summer of 2017, what we see shown on this slide is that nearly 7 out of 10 survey respondents said that the United States was on the wrong track, as compared to fewer than half in October of 2012. No huge surprise there, but we're just painting a picture of a decline in optimism, a great rise in disappointment, okay? And then on a much more personal level, we asked survey respondents immediately after the election and then in the subsequent third wave if they were worried about the deportation of a close friend or a family member. And again, we see rather significant levels of anxiety about deportation. We also asked about concerns for family finances, and we find similar kinds of anxieties about financial well-being. So what does this all mean in terms of attitudes towards American politics, Americans in general, participation, and so on? Well, the next theme we're going to cover is immigrant resilience, okay, which is part of the subtitle for the book. So I'm going to now turn the presentation over to Michael. I'm going to stop screen sharing. And Michael, you should be able to take it away.
Right. So I'm going to pick up where Jay left off. So we've seen that in the aftermath of the 2016 election, immigrants are feeling this sense of threat, of fear, anxiety, and anger. And so what are the implications? And so we look at a number of different sort of attitudes about how they feel about government, how they feel about society, how they feel about other Americans. And one thing you see over this period from 2012, our first line survey, and then this period of 2016 through 2017 is increasing doubts about government. I mean, so this is not too surprising. None of this is all too that surprising. But what's interesting is that despite, again, this anxiety, despite the feeling that the country is going off in the wrong direction, doubts about government, they're signaling of a hard exit. Their plans to remain in the US or to leave for another country, those don't seem to change actually really at all over this period. There's no sense of that immigrants are kind of pulling back. And the same thing is true of their trust of Americans as people. That doesn't seem to change very much over this period, again, from 2012 to 2017. So even with the election of Trump, so certain kinds of attitudes seem to hold stable, even as their sort of perceptions of government are sort of shifting markedly in a more negative direction. So this is all to give you sort of a broad sense, a broad picture of what's going on, but we're wanting to leverage this panel design that we have to get a better, some ways, causal sense of what's going on with immigrant attitudes over this period. So recall that we have three waves. So we have a wave of where we surveyed immigrants before the elections and before Trump, so in the summer of 2016, a second just after Trump was elected in the late fall of 2016, and then about 6 to 7 months later in the summer of 2017. So we're using the sort of first wave as a kind of baseline. The second wave is a kind of where the intervention is, Trump is elected, and the third is sort of gauging what the change in attitudes is over that period. So, and then sort of controlling for anxiety and disappointment and other demographic factors. So we're able to model this sort of impact of change and change over time. So just to give you an example, this is looking at the impact of anxiety, anger, and disappointment on civic attitudes, and in particular, whether government is run for big interests. And you can see that in the sort of the bottom there, the effects of the summer of 2017, that immigrants' attitudes about the US being on the wrong track, and Trump prompting anger and fear, all have significant effects. Those sort of aqua-colored bars indicate significant effects on how immigrants feel about government and their negative perceptions about government. So So not to show you model after model, but this is, so we use this modeling strategy on a number of dependent variables. And basically what we find is that anxiety, anger, disappointment all have sort of similar effects on the perceived trustworthiness of government officials, the amount of corruption in government, but they don't have the similar kinds of effects on overall trustworthiness of Americans, on immigrants' own feelings of patriotism or their plans to remain in the country. So in some sense, these models echo the earlier findings we showed you. So another question we had was, well, what about variations by civic status? So whether someone is a naturalized citizen or a green card holder, a permanent resident, or in the United States without documentation. What about how much time they spent in the United States or their state of residence? So does it make a difference if someone is living in California or if somebody is living in, say, Georgia or Arizona, and their country of origin as well. So we include each of these in the model. So this is just to give you a sense of why sort of state of residence might make a difference. This is the sort of range of laws passed across states in this time period between 2005 and 2012. And where some states are essentially more welcoming, they're passing pieces of legislation that indicate some openness to immigrants, and particularly to undocumented immigrants, and some states that are passing legislation that's precisely the opposite. So we construct a scale, kind of positive and negative laws passed across these states, and use these to model, include these in the model. So the interesting thing is that these effects of anxiety, anger, disappointment are not significantly moderated by an immigrant's civic legal status, by their time in the United States, by their state of residence, or by country of origin. I will say there are some ways in which, in some cases, when an immigrant from Mexico is somewhat more worried about having a family member or close friend deported than immigrants from other countries. But some of these, actually, I have to say, were quite surprising to me. I was very surprised that, for instance, legal status of immigrants didn't have more of an effect. But no, then these were not part of the story. So the overall story is fairly consistent, that immigrants feel the sense of anxiety and threat as Trump is elected. This has an effect on their attitudes toward government and the direction of the country, less so about other Americans, and doesn't really seem to change their decisions about remaining in the United States. So what does it do for immigrant engagement? So this is just a slide to give you a sense that in this period of 2017, 2018, 2019, this is as Trump has been elected, the Trump administration is taking office. There's a lot of attention in particular on women's marches. But the interesting thing is, and this count of protest events by year and issue area, is that throughout this period, there are more immigrants' rights marches taking place every year than, in fact, there are women's marches. And so there's a good deal of mobilization going on here. In this slide, we show, this is the response from our surveys of how, what % of our respondents indicated that they had joined a rally, a protest or demonstration. And the first bar up above is from the Latino National Survey in 2006. And there you see, just over 30% of respondents indicated they had participated in one of these kinds of protests or demonstrations. And that, so if you look at the lower bars in 2012, the percentage is significantly lower, and entering into the 2016 sort of elections, it's lower, a bit lower still. But by the summer of 2017, you see almost a doubling of the percentage of immigrants who are indicating that they've participated in one kind or another of these rallies or protests or demonstrations to support immigrants and immigrants' rights. So, so what effect does this the impact of civic stress have on involvement in a march or protest to support immigrants in the first year of the Trump administration? And you can see that that feeling a sort of anger or fear in response to Trump's election, being worried about the deportation of someone close to you, both are significant, have significant effects on the chances that a respondent will say that they were involved in a march or protest. So is it just about protest? And we find that no, it's not, that there's a relationship between protest activism and more conventional kinds of participation. So whether it's attending a community meeting, being engaged in problem solving with your neighbors or members of your community, contacting an official, that for each of these, these forms of engagement are interlinked, and they all sort of increase over this period. So thinking back to our hypotheses, the civic erosion hypothesis, we were thought might be that in the aftermath of the election, where immigrants are particularly threatened and disappointed by the election results, would lead to a kind of alienation or withdrawal. And this was, as Jay pointed out, kind of the media narrative after the 2016 election, that the sense of fear that immigrants were going into hiding, that they were withdrawing. This is not at all what we find. That we do see mistrust, increased mistrust in government. Again, not mistrust in other Americans, loss of patriotism or desire to leave the United States. Instead, we posit there's a kind of loyal opposition in the kind of terms that we were using earlier, that yes, Latino immigrants are disappointed by the outcome of the election, and that disappointment runs deep. There's cynicism about government leadership. There's cynicism about government, but it does not seem to translate into a soft exit where people are withdrawing from civic life or disengaging from their role in their communities, or a hard exit. So there's no indication there's an increased desire to leave the United States. So our overall takeaways are that fear, anger, the sense of threat, disappointment do not lead to alienation and withdrawal, but the opposite. And that there aren't as many variations as certainly I might have expected based on citizenship status, time in the US, state of residence, or country of origin. And that all of this is sort of part of a narrative about where first and second generation Latinos are poised to be critical actors. We're certainly in 2020 played a critical role, where 10% of all voters were immigrants, about 20% were immigrants or their children. And we're tilting toward the Democratic Party, but probably, so safe to say, not solidly incorporated into either party. So here was sort of what happened in the aftermath of the 2020 elections. So you had very high Latino turnout in 2020. And we argue that the pattern of Latino participation reverted back to its pre-2016 norm. So a lot of the media coverage after 2020 was that there was unusually high Latino turnout in favor of the Republican candidates. we have a more tempered view of this, and one we're happy to talk about. But there is a rebound in support in 2020 for the Republican Party. It's unlikely that there'll be anything like, and we haven't seen anything since, like a post-mortem among Republicans of what they could do better to reach out to Latino voters, as there was in 2012. And the Biden administration, for its part, has been signaling these moves on immigration, although it's become quite complicated even in the last couple of weeks, exactly how they're going to proceed on immigration issues. But they're clearly trying to diffuse immigration as an issue. And this may have a positive effect for first and second generation Latino voters. But this is a quite complicated sort of conversation, one I'm sure that we'll have. And with that, really, that's it. This is I'm giving you a very sort of quick and dirty overview of this project. We thank you for the opportunity to be here with you, and we'll say that we're in the process now of making these data public. So we'll be depositing these data with the ICPSR, and so you guys can have at it and explore these data yourselves. So thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. My ears perked up when you said you're making these data public. That's amazing data that you have, and really an amazing set of findings. So now let's turn it over to Professor Hajnal with a set of comments.
Great. Hello, everybody. And I'll just, okay, so I probably won't take up all of my time here. I have a problem, which is I really like this book. I think it's compelling. I think it's convincing. So I don't have a lot in terms of critiques here. I'll mention a couple things, but I think it's worth reiterating, highlighting the contributions that are here, right? So you got to see it a little bit yourself, but let me just emphasize that number one, you should read this book because it does address this really critical question, which is how do Latino immigrants respond to threat? And it's critical not only, I think, to understand Latino immigrants themselves and their behavior, but this, as Michael was sort of intimating at the very end of the talk, is critical for understanding the future trajectory of American politics and maybe America in general, right? So are we going to see an exit on one side, or are Latino immigrants going to join in actively in a coalition as their numbers increase and potentially dominate Republican politics over the long term, right? So this is about America's potential civil war and who's going to win and who's not going to win. And so this, yeah, wide-ranging implications. So the second contribution here is in terms of answering that question, and that is the book, I think, convincingly shows that the threat posed by Donald Trump and more broadly the American Party towards immigrant Latinos did in fact lead to fear and anger and ultimately distrust in government. That I think is exactly what we would expect to find. But the key here is that these two authors provide the best data to answer this question. It's timely data, strong, sophisticated analysis. Then you add clear exposition, and so that answer is again thoroughly convincing. Perhaps more surprising is that they show equally convincingly that threat doesn't lead to withdrawal. So it's not like, as the two authors indicated, that there were Latino immigrants are thinking about leaving the country in larger numbers. They're not disillusioned with America as a whole, and so they fear what's happening. They feel threatened by what's happening, but they are not shying away from that, and that gets to the holding fast, the resilience, and in fact, the results suggest that Latino immigrants may be, in fact, increasing their engagement, at least in terms of protests. So there's all this, I think, then demonstrates the resilience of immigrants in the face of a major threat. I think the other really interesting thing about this book, and was, I think, surprising, is that the book shows that the resilience of Latino immigrants really doesn't vary across the immigrant population in terms of, as Michael and Jay were saying, national origin group, the nature of local state politics, and so on and so forth. So it's a general story about Latino immigrants, and it's an important story. Okay, so I was, yeah, so I am critiquing, so I had to at least come up with, I couldn't come up with anything really damning on the data or analysis side, but so I will quibble a little bit about the setup of the book, which doesn't have some implications for the analysis, but largely it's just a quibble. The setup of the book sort of starts with Trump as a sort of significant break from the past, that he is different, unique, and a unique threat to the Latino immigrant population. And one could argue that Trump is largely just a continuation of a strategy by the Republican Party to target immigrants, and in particular Latino immigrants, to garner white votes. And while Trump may have been more explicit and more extreme, he was just one further step on this long pathway. And if we take that interpretation, then the question is, how much change should we have expected pre-Trump versus post-Trump? And so if immigrants are feeling a threat, if the system is problematic before and after, how much change should we see? And then another, this is even more of a quibble. The book starts out by talking about the potential and maybe even the likelihood of bipartisan consensus on comprehensive immigration reform. And certainly there were some Republicans on the ticket in 2016 that were talking about it, but it's also just as true that, say, in terms of congressional voting patterns, there's been more and more partisan polarization on immigration over time. So in lieu of really any reasonable critiques of the book, I thought I might just spark some conversation by raising some questions about things that aren't in the book, but that the book, I think, can speak to and the authors can speak to, right? So Michael finished by talking about the Latino vote in 2020. And I think he is right that the sense of a major movement towards the Republican Party is totally overblown. But on the other hand, if we take the book at its face value, which I do, and fear and anger among the Latino population, and particularly among Latino immigrants, grew markedly, why was there not a move away from Trump and the Republican Party? Like, I think that you would, based on this book, have predicted a significant shift away from Trump, and why did we not get that, would be one question. The second question here is looking at sort of whether there's variation within the Latino immigrant population. And the book does look at a lot of different dimensions, but I still think it's possible that the threat may lead to mobilization of some and deterrence of others, and then you get the sort of the net null effect that you do in the book. And it's possible that one thing that might structure that differential effect is something like efficacy, right? So do I think I have a say in American government? So I'd be interested to see whether that variable is in the data set. Maybe now that it's becoming public, somebody could look at that and sort of look to see whether your attitudes about does my voice matter? Does that structure how threat affects you and what you do post-threat? Then another, I think, interesting question to think about is, so this book sort of suggests that major threats within the country don't change the trajectory of the immigrant population in terms of a hard exit, right? So, but clearly it looks like changes in the threat level within a country like the United States and perhaps a declining threat post-2020 have led to larger numbers of immigrants potentially coming to the country. So do we make a distinction between immigrants who are already here and their behavior towards a threat versus immigrants who could be coming to the country and their behavior in terms of migrating or not migrating based on the existence and growth of a threat or non-threat? Also be very curious, I know that the data didn't cover Asian immigrants, but how the authors think this story fits or doesn't fit with Asian Americans or Asian immigrants. And then finally, there was all this interesting data and analysis of protests in the book that essentially concluded with, the variables that we have don't explain the protests and shifts in protests. And again, I'd be curious to see and hear from the authors what they would investigate or what they think actually does drive protests and the timing of the protests that they talked about. But all in all, again, I think this is a fabulous book. People should get it. It addresses, again, a really important question, and it provides a compelling, well-documented answer to that question. So I'll stop here.
Okay, thank you so much, Zoli. So do the authors want to take a few minutes to respond?
Yeah, I can jump in. First, just thanks a million, Zoli, for all of these very thoughtful questions that you're raising at the end and the careful read. One thing that springs to mind when you ask, how different was Trump? And I can see where that's coming from. Is it a difference of degree and magnitude, or is he just a different animal? One thing we do in the book is kind of play up in the first chapter a bit of a disconnect between the base of the Republican Party and the elites, the Jeb Bush sort of level elites. And so I think you can see the roots of, I don't call it Trumpism or something, or the anti-immigrant agenda. You can see that as early as the 90s. So in that sense, I see your point, that he might be more in the mold of the base that became known as the Trump base, but it was sort of, you could see seeds of that early on. So that's a terrific, I think, very valid point. Okay, now, but that being said, I think at least at a rhetorical level during the campaigns, there is strong evidence. The article that I referenced is by a sociologist at Harvard, Lamont is her name. It came out in the British Journal of Sociology a few years ago. The content analyzed the rhetoric, and Trump clearly was fixated on immigrants and refugees. I had a research assistant look at the extemporaneous speech that he gave and also compare it to earlier Republican nominees going back several election cycles and Democratic nominees. And Trump is by far and away, he's so different rhetorically that it would be hard, I think, to say that's a difference of degree. It kind of looks like just a real difference. So, Michael, do you want to jump in?
Sure, I'll jump in on a couple of the questions. I think so. As the same, really great questions, great set of questions to just jumpstart this conversation. I think we could have done a better job, I think, of looking to see whether some immigrants are mobilized and some are demobilized. I think you're right that in the end we're taking sort of the kind of net of where immigrants ended up and not sufficiently sort of disaggregating what the potential pathways are for at least some immigrants who might be demobilized. That said, then we may be sort of underplaying the effects of mobilization for a pretty large group of immigrants. And even if what we're saying is that there may be some people who are demobilized, that means that the effects for the people who are mobilized are even larger than what we're showing. But it's worth, I think that's definitely something that I think we should have done better. The question about what happened in 2020 is so complex. Jay and I have talked about this a lot because this book was coming out in the sort of context of the 2020 elections and the immediate aftermath, and we were getting a lot of press and having these conversations with journalists, and they were all asking us this question, like, basically what is going on. And I think the problem is that I think the answer is not a simple one. And I think Jay and I have sort of settled on that 2020 was in some sense a reset, that the 2-to-1 split that you've seen over many election cycles sort of reasserted itself. So more or less breaking in Democrats' favor, but a third of, or a little bit less of Latino voters going for the Republican Party. But so why was that with Trump still in office? And I mean, I've seen a lot of different plausible explanations. And, I will just mention a couple here. One of them is that the kind of anti-immigrant rhetoric that Trump was playing up in 2016, leading into 2016 elections, kind of tapered off in 2020. It's not as visible. And the things that were very much on people's minds leading to 2020 were the pandemic and the economy. And on both those things, I think Latinos voted more like other voters. The second thing I want to mention is that the Democrats nominated Biden, and Biden has a complicated history with Latino and Latino immigrants. He was Obama's vice president, and Obama was the deporter in chief. He was he deported a lot of immigrants, and I don't think, and I've done other work and with other surveys. If you remind people of the fact that Obama deported immigrants, it shifts people away from the Democratic Party. So by nominating Biden as their candidate, the party was essentially reminding Latinos and Latino immigrants about that history. And I think it's a complicated history. So yeah. So. And Asians as immigrants, I just wanted to mention quickly, because I think they're kind of, in some ways, fit in with the story that we're telling about threat and the reactions to threat and mobilization. But the story is different, and I think that if we had been able to do a similar kind of three-wave panel study, there would have been some similarities and some differences in these patterns. And I can, I'm happy to talk about that more, but that's not really a great answer. But anyway, so let's open it up.
Great, thank you so much. Yes, let's definitely open it up. I'm going to use my chair's prerogative and follow up with a couple questions that are close to what Zoli had mentioned, and you guys even recognized in your conclusion that this is a surprising finding, right? That the respondents are expressing fear and anxiety, but they are also expressing willingness to protest. And so I had a couple questions about that. The first is, did you look at this by state? So you showed us this neat graph that shows that California is like a very inclusive, permissive state, and then you have these other states that are much more restrictive. And so are the respondents who are saying they're willing to protest, are they more likely to be in California, for example? Are you able to tell us how that varies by state?
Yeah, I can jump in on that, Michael. For starters, yeah, what we did, we couldn't get terribly granular. I mean, it's a big survey, but it's not a huge survey, so that we can parse out things too specifically with respect to states. What we did do in looking at state level variations is look at that scale that was on one of the slides that Michael covered that showed how restrictive versus welcoming a state is in terms of its policy dispositions. And we use that as an interactive variable to look at. We looked at whether it predicted, the level of just kind of mean level of attitudes and participation and so on. And we looked at whether it would interact with some of these measures of anxieties, fear, anger, and so on, so the main predictors. And the expectation was that in more supportive environments, right, where there's less of a fear of sort of reprisal or so on, you might see more engagement and more corrective action, perhaps. Yeah, but we did not, as Michael said, and as the book makes out. Yeah, we didn't get a whole lot of oomph from that variable, even though, of course, the state disposition, the policy disposition matters an awful lot in terms of the day-to-day lives of immigrants in all kinds of ways. But with respect to the things we were modeling, we didn't get a whole lot of differentiation based just on that kind of continuum.
Yeah, I just want to add to that a little bit. There's another project that I've been working on with another group of scholars looking at intergroup contact and trust and civic engagement in the metro Atlanta area and the metro Philadelphia area. And part of the reason why we picked those two metro areas was because we expected there would be more there's some differentiation between sort of immigrants in a more welcoming or at least neutral state like Pennsylvania and a more somewhat more hostile state like Georgia. And the interesting thing is that we don't find that at all. Those state level differences don't play out in the way that that these groups interact with one another or in the overall findings that we have, which I think is super interesting. Anyway, I don't know what that says.
Fascinating, yeah. Okay, so moving on to the questions I'm seeing in the Q&A. So first question from David Cook Martin. Thanks for this terrific presentation. Among Latino immigrants, do you see any significant deviation from overall trends you found by religious affiliation?
So this is probably another one of those areas where we probably should have spent more time. There's a lot of correlation between, so the main differences are Catholic and Protestant, and Latino Protestants are largely evangelical, and there's a lot of correlation there with their partisan leanings. But Jay, did we do anything? Did we look at correlation between religion and fear, anxiety, withdrawal?
It's a rich data set, Michael, and we and choices were made. Yeah. No, but okay, that's an indirect.
There's another paper waiting to be written.
No,
so
yeah,
this data's released.
Well, this is it can be developed. No, we did. No, religion appears, but in the form of the extent of religious practice. Okay, so when modeling involvement and participation, different modes of participation, yeah, we included that as a predictor among others. To put alongside the kind of anxiety, anger, et cetera, and so that's where it appears, and so that very much is scratching the surface in terms of religious differences.
Okay. Next question is from Albert Mankey. It might be related to some of the stuff we were talking about the surprising finding of feeling anxiety, but yet still feeling willing to protest. Because the question is about, first, thank you for your great presentation. How do you conceptualize and define resilience? Would it be possible to identify factors or dynamics that are favorable toward creating resilience and spaces of mutual support?
Yeah, I mean, so when we're talking about resilience in a fairly narrow way, sort of this do people stay engaged? Do their attachments? Do they retain their attachments? Do they retain their sort of faith in institutions in the aftermath of an electoral loss that they find threatening? And the answer to that is yes. Now, this is sort of despite, as many of you have pointed out, this kind of some surprising finding about fear and anger. And Jay and I, there's talked about this quite a lot as well, and there's a bit of discussion about this in the book, about, there's a literature about in social psychology in particular about the effects of fear versus anger versus other kinds of emotions on your engagement, and usually these things are seen as having quite different effects. I mean, one thing we didn't really get into the talk is but Jay mentioned in the presentation is that we found that actually most respondents are not simply fearful, and they're not usually just simply angry. There's some combination of these things. They're angry and fearful, but the effects of fear and anger are actually, for what we're looking at, not that different. They're motivating people in their engagement, even as they're also making them feel less happy about the direction of the country and government. But Jay, you should jump in.
Yeah, no, that's all right. Let me just to tack onto that to say that we do realize resilience can be understood and interpreted in many different ways. So in our case, we thought of resilience just in terms of attachments. How sturdy are these attachments towards the United States, and how engaged are immigrants in spite of the strong headwinds. But there are other. I mean, we realize that there are other ways to understand resilience, and if I'm sort of understanding what the question is alluding to, it's sort of interpersonal resilience, or keeping engaged in networks of support and things like that. And the line study might be able to address that in some sense, but that was not sort of analytically our main focus. It really was rooted on kind of the trajectory of political acculturation and resilience being understood as, how far or how deep does the disaffection go, right? Does it start and stop with concerns about governing institutions, or is it more generalized across all of American society and across respondents themselves as participatory actors? And the fact that it's a constrained effect, just limited to the institutions themselves, we took, our shorthand for that was resilience. That's what we landed on, because it shows a kind of resilience and acculturation patterns.
Thank you. Let me jump over to David Fitzgerald, who has his hand up.
Hi, thanks very much. So I have a question about these, the gender breakdown of the Trump voting Latino population in 2020. And is that gender gap any different than it is for, say, native white voters?
Yeah, I can jump in, and I'm working off of memory, David. Thanks for the question. At some point in the campaign, and I forget what the final exit poll showed, but during the campaign, there was a gender gap among Latino voters, but it was not as great as with the overall electorate. Okay, so it was there, it was significant, but it was somewhat constrained, and I guess owing to the fact that within the general electorate, the gender gap has just grown so much over recent election cycles. Michael, does that accord with what you're remembering? I don't have the exit poll findings.
I mean, it's funny because this is one of those things that has come up as one of the possible explanatory sort of factors in increased Latino support for the Republican Party in 2020 is looking at gender, both say machismo among men and whatever deference among women. I don't know how it was being spun, but in order to make that argument, you have to be able to place the Latino gender gap in sort of the context of the larger gender gap. And there, I think Jay is exactly right that the Latino gender gap is smaller, somewhat smaller than the overall gender gap. So if there are these weird gender dynamics among Latinos, then you have to sort of say how they're different than the larger gender gap and the larger gender dynamics. and so I still think that people are in this sort of casting about for, how to explain what they saw as sort of a puzzling result in 2020. Which again, just to reiterate that Jay and I don't actually think it's that puzzling. It's sort of returned to a norm. And if anything, that 2016 was a bit of an outlier, and that Latinos were less likely to vote for a Republican candidate than they had been historically. And it's very much, I think, because Trump made his anti-immigrant rhetoric so front and center.
If I can just tack on to that, yeah, and this is a point that relates to what you're saying, Michael, about maybe over-reporting minor differences in shifts among Latino voters. Just the other day, I downloaded the national election study that has been released for 2020. And I believe they only have the first wave, the pre-election wave of the study. So you can't look at actual vote choices, which that's asked in the post-election wave. Okay, but it's a panel back. Okay, and so I merged the 2016 responses with the 2020 pre-election responses and sorted out Latino voters. And so you can do a cross-tabulation to look at individual level shifts. And there's not very much shifting going on. There's a lot of continuity as I recall. 45% of the Latino voters were consistent Democrats, meaning, Clinton, then Biden. About a dozen, 12% thereabouts were consistent Trump supporters. And when you look at movement from, Clinton to Trump then in 2020 or Trump to Biden, there's not very much, a few percentage points. And it's like this much difference from Democrat to Republican versus Republican to Democrat. And so I mean, it's so different that it'd have to be trivial statistically. So.
It's so hard because a lot of the narratives that come out are the narratives that come from the exit polls. And we know there are so many problems with the exit polls. And then we have to fight these initial narratives with like much higher quality data. And so, yeah.
Well, there's a sort of, the dog biting the person versus the person biting the dog kind of, quality to this that the journalists, are attentive to. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So our next question is from Leslie Ayala. Does the book talk about an increase of protests or civic engagement within the undocumented community after the 2016 election?
Yeah, the short answer is yes. I mean, that we find this increase in protest activity across all our entire sample, and it's true regardless of whether you're undocumented or have a permanent residence or whether you're a citizen. In the aftermath of 2016, that was one of the very clear findings, is that this protest behavior increases.
There's a question in the chat from Tara Karlemke. Very straightforward methods question. How did you define protest events and then determine the number?
Yeah, I can jump in on that. That one slide that Michael showed with the 4 bars, there was a variety of instrumentation there. In the line study, in the third wave, we asked, over the last 3 or 4 months, have you turned out for in support of in support of immigrant rights? Have you taken part in a demonstration, a march, or some other protest activity in support of immigrant rights, or in support of immigrants, is what we asked. Okay, and before the election, we didn't ask that exactly. We did ask about rallying, just general political rallies during the campaign. So that was the closest comparison we could get to. The same is for the 2012 lines. We asked about, sort of campaign-based rallying. And then in the 2006 survey that was on that slide, it was a bit different still. I think something since the beginning of the year, it was a Pew survey. And they asked, this year, have you taken part in protests or demonstration in support of immigrants? Tara, does that answer your question?
We'll see. Yes. Takes a little while to type it in. It's related to a question I had, which is how much should we worry about response bias, right? Of people saying that, well, they have participated, but now you've made them feel these emotions, right? They feel angry and anxious, and you know, maybe you could speak a little bit to kind of the process of interviewing these people and the interviewers and you know the trust that's established between the interviewer and the interviewee.
Yeah, sure. I can jump in again, Michael, if
Sure, go ahead.
A few quick words. Okay, so almost all of the surveys, the vast majority, were conducted in Spanish with native Spanish speakers by the respondents' preference. We worked with a firm with deep experience interviewing immigrants, including for political kinds of surveys. You know, and much of the instrumentation was field tested. A lot of it was adapted from the American National Election Studies Spanish version. Wherever possible, we tried to go with very standard sorts of wordings to get as valid, you know, a response as possible. You are right that building rapport is a very big deal, especially when it's through the phone rather than in person, and you can't take a lot of time. You know, steps were taken to reassure, and certainly per the IRB, right? We had to tell respondents, please, you know, if you're uncomfortable responding in any way, that's fine, you know, we can just skip. So those were precautions taken. Then at the end of each survey wave, we did have interviewer responses asking, you know, were there any times when the respondent didn't seem cooperative, or you know, or was there any suspiciousness on the part of the, you know, these kinds of questions to look at the general impression of quality. And, you know, there were some respondents, you know, we couldn't say, you know, that everybody was uniformly, you know, deemed to be cooperative and so on. So but there's not that much variation. And in some analysis that we've done, you know, just as, and this isn't in the book, but just as a sort of, you know, just for our own sake, you know, we've looked at kind of, does it make a difference if we select out people, you know, those few people who were deemed to be uncooperative or so on, and really, no, I mean, it doesn't. So it is possible to check the quality, but point very well taken. At the same time, we are talking with, you know, this is a vulnerable population in some respects, and the material we're going over is controversial, right, to say the least, in some cases.
Yeah, I mean, there's now having done a number of surveys and worked with both in qualitative and quantitative contexts, I'm always very sensitive to the possibility. There are two kinds of possible problems. One of them is the one that Jay has talked about, where there's an item in a questionnaire, in a survey, that is problematic for the person you're talking to, and so there are different ways you can see whether an item is problematic. You know, people can end the survey, they can skip the item, they can refuse to answer. I mean, there are lots of ways in which people can signal that they're being made uncomfortable. And as Jay was pointing out, we don't find a lot of evidence of that. There's a different kind of worry, and I hesitate to mention this because it raises a whole set of issues around surveys and conducting surveys with vulnerable populations. And it's that, so let's say, I mean, there's a possibility that we're getting an overall kind of sampling bias. You know, the kind of people who are willing to sort of pick up the phone and answer questions in a survey. So the problem isn't during the survey. The problem is who's actually answering the phone to take the survey. And it could be that we're underestimating the people who are in fact very fearful and very anxious, because they're not the people who are going to be answering the phone and talking to us to answer a survey. and uh, so there is that possibility. I think, you know, we try, you know, to see whether there are sampling errors, like, you know, are we capturing the people who we think, you know, are we talking to the people that we think we should be talking to, and then building in a kind of weighting strategy, so that if there are imbalances, that, you know, we're accounting for it. But it is something, I just say this as someone who has done these surveys, it always worries me. And I think we should be worried about whether we're accurately capturing the opinions of the people that we say we're representing.
Absolutely. So another question in the Q&A. So this is from Chelsea Bustos Malvas, who thanks you for the amazing presentation and asks, the book says there is currently a large population migrating from Asia to the US, then from Latin America, so a larger population. Why? Does the US government hold more strict policies for Latin American peoples wanting to migrate to the US, or is this change due to fear from Latin American peoples, or would-be migrants?
So again, this is a complicated question, but I don't think it's either of those things. I mean, there's this pattern of seeing a rise in immigration from Latin America in the mid to later part of the 20th century, and then a rise in Asian population from Asia, and now superseding that immigration from Latin America. Those patterns have been going on for a while. So the best explanation of this, I think, that I've heard is Doug Massey's explanation about why we would expect to see immigration from Latin America decline. You know, basically it sort of peaks in the 90s and early 2000s and then declines. And it simply has to do with the demographics of the region. That, and particularly immigration from Mexico, has to do with a relative youth bubble that formed as families grow larger in the mid 20th century, and then families get smaller as that century progresses. So you have a bubble of people who are at the right age, the right demographics to migrate, and then that group of people declines over time. Now you could argue, if you look at the current you know, people crossing the southern border today, you know, many of those people are not from Mexico, they're from Central America, and there's a whole different dynamic there that's driving that migration. And it's also partly demographic. It's about, again, who is willing and capable of migrating, but there's also this whole set of pressures policy going again many decades. So this is all to say that I think there are larger demographic pressures and that have led to both a rise and then a sort of decline of migration from Mexico, and a rise of migration from Central America, and a rise of migration from Asia. But that's a whole conversation. That would be a whole course all by itself. So.
Yeah, summarized in 2 minutes.
Yes.
So our next question is from our very own Roger Weldon. We're muted.
Thanks, Jane Michael. This has been a terrific presentation, a fascinating book. I guess I have 2, possibly 3 questions, 2 of which might be contradictory, but I'm going to pose them nonetheless. On the one hand, I guess I'm wondering about the framing of the project and the book, and that is, you know, you raise the possibility that given the turn in American politics, that Latino immigrants might opt for exit, whether kind of exit in a kind of literal sense, go home, or just exit in the sense of detachment. But I'm wondering whether that's the right frame. I mean, in many ways, couldn't you make the argument that this is a trapped population? I mean, home is less attractive than ever, and however bad things were under Trump, and they were certainly terrible, it was still an awful lot better than most of the countries of origin, where things perhaps, certainly if we think about Central America, maybe even Mexico, parts of Latin America, that things deteriorated even more rapidly. And at the same time, that this was a population that, well, it couldn't, of course, engage in the type of circular migration to which Mexican immigrants have been habituated for a long period of time. And there was always, and for at least the undocumented share of this population, which I would think is about 35%, they're also trapped. There's no way to legal status, and who knows when that's going to happen. So that, given the fact that this is a population with nowhere to go, and whose settlement in the United States has been growing, so their attachment, time that's spent here has increased, aren't these precisely the conditions that would make them all the more resilient, that would make them more likely to protest, more likely to engage, however miserable the conditions were, because that's the only option they have. So that's kind of question number one. Now, question number two, which maybe goes against that question, is the thing that really surprised me in listening to your presentation is that this is also a population that is very heterogeneous. I mean, with respect to national origin, with respect to socioeconomic status, with respect to citizenship and legal status, and those differences have been much greater than they were maybe even 2012, certainly 10, 15 years ago. So I'm just surprised that you didn't find that I mean, you kind of generalized to this population, but I guess I'm not fully willing to accept that generalization. Seems to me those underlying sources of heterogeneity should have been very powerful. And then my last question is, and perhaps I missed this, just how interested in this, in the election and politics were your respondents? I mean, I took a quick look at the 2012 survey. 2012 is a pretty contested election and reasonably close, but barely, a little over 50% said that they were somewhat or a lot interested. And I don't know how that compares to what you find from the ANES, but it's not an overwhelming amount of interest in a highly contested election. So those are my three questions to you.
Yeah, I can jump in. Thanks for all of that, Roger. These are great comments. I think there is much more that can be said about the heterogeneity of effects. I mean, we landed on the ones that seemed most reasonable, but certainly not the full kind of set of different, you mentioned, well, a lot of different demographic background variables that, underlying heterogeneity that might have been relevant in addition to the ones we pursue. So I would agree that we can look, more extensively at national origin for, issues of class, or, I mean, there are a lot of different ways to cut the data. Yeah, in terms of political interest, yeah, at one point, I think with the 2012 study, and it's been a while, but I recall doing a comparison between US-born Latinos as shown in the election study, and then the lines study, and differentiating the naturalized lines respondents versus the non-citizens and so on. Yeah, and there is a drop-off in political, there is a distinction between citizen and non-citizen in terms of political interest. It's significant, but substantively, as I recall, it wasn't hugely, there wasn't a huge amount of separation. From my vantage point, the level of interest among non-citizens is striking, because one could start out with the assumption that it should be really low, and it just was only modestly lower than for naturalized citizens and US-born Latinos. That's a recollection. I couldn't put a finer point on that, but as I recall, there was some significant degree of attentiveness to American politics, and also in terms of just actual participation in campaign politics. There was a fair amount of that going on as well. So, Michael, do you want to jump in on?
Sure. So the framing, Roger's as always, you ask these kind of hard-hitting questions. On the framing of the project, I sort of hard exit and soft exit. So I kind of agree that, you know, there are reasons to think that people won't really take the hard exit option. But we don't actually spend a whole lot of time on this in the book. I mean, it's really the soft exit that we're more interested in, that you know, again, this is in the context of a media narrative and a larger narrative. It's all about withdrawal, going into hiding, pulling back, and there are theoretical expectations to think that people under threat do this. They withdraw, they pull back, they protect themselves, and that's not what we find. And I think I disagree to think that that's their only real alternative. I think it's much more likely that if people are feeling threatened, their expectation should be that they try and protect themselves and pull back. I'm still a little surprised that wasn't what we found. That if you look at protest activity in particular, that goes up, and if you look at other forms of civic engagement, it holds steady. So there's no sign of soft exit. And again, I guess I'm also surprised that there isn't the kind of heterogeneity if the population isn't showing up more in our findings. I'm surprised by this too. You know, it could be, as Jay was saying, that there's some other kind of heterogeneity that we're not fully taking into account that would do more.
Well, can I jump in, Michael?
Yeah. I just will say one thing. So one thing, it's just a colleague of mine here, Dan Hopkins, has been wrote a book and was making this argument that one of the things that's been happening in American politics is that local and state differences in American politics have been diminishing, and we have this national narrative of politics that everyone is subjected to, and we all vote now at every level, whether it's for, you know, your city council member or for your state representative or for a member of Congress, as if we're voting for president. Like everything is seen through a partisan lens, and I don't think that it's. So one reason why we may not be seeing a lot of heterogeneity, or the heterogeneity may not be playing out in our findings, is that immigrants are subject to this too, that they're part of this huge national narrative of where everything is framed through this partisan lens, and they're picking that up too. And this is in some ways is what Jay and I were looking at in 2012 about how immigrants learn about politics and through these campaigns. So anyway, Jay.
Yeah, well, I was just going to jump in and actually allude to the point you were making just now, but by saying that, you know, in the sort of Trump era, in the general political environment, we're finding a sort of one-size-fits-all reaction, so that immigrants with deep roots or thin roots, and, you know, Mexicans and non-Mexicans and so on, they all kind of behave roughly in the same way. And one of the things that Michael, we've talked about, and I think it's in the book, but I know we've at least talked about it, that a sort of one-size-fits-all scenario is in keeping with what you're saying about Dan's work, but also in the kinds of signaling coming out of the party system, and in particular out of the Trump White House, that there really was a sort of very broad-based line of attack on immigrants and other groups that did not differentiate, and that could have had the consequence of blurring any, you know, pre-existing lines of heterogeneity, right, in terms of the response.
Okay, well, on that note, I want to thank our panelists and our audience, and I encourage you to come to next week's book talk, LA Rising, Korean Relations with Blacks and Latinos After Civil Unrest by Chae-Young Park, professor of anthropology and Asian American studies at UCLA. So thank you again, everybody, and I hope you have a wonderful Friday and a wonderful weekend.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Yes. That was great.
Thank you.
Thanks, Zoltan.